Also willkommen zur Verleihung der Urkunden an die Gewinner des GIUB International Paper Award. Das findet zeitgemäß unter solchen Umständen statt. Um den Preis jetzt mal wirklich ganz groß einzuordnen, gehe ich bis in die Bibel zurück. Beim Turmbau zu Babel war Gott so erzürnt über ein Projekt, das bis in den Himmel hinaufwuchs, und er hatte Angst, dass die Menschen nicht mehr auf ihn hören und dass er irgendwann mal, dass sie übermütig werden. Und da hat er die Sprachen verwirrt, und seitdem sprechen wir in unterschiedlichen Sprachen. Zu bestimmten Zeiten gab es dann immer gemeinschaftliche Sprachen, Umgangssprachen. Zeitlang war das das Griechische, später war das das Lateinische, eine Zeit lang war das sogar das Deutsche, und heute ist es unzweifelhaft das Englische, das ist unsere Common Language. Wer in der Wissenschaft etwas werden will, der muss Englisch publizieren. Und vor diesem Hintergrund ist es vollkommen richtig gewesen, dass Frau Giertz eine Idee entwickelt hat, wie diejenigen, die eben in Englisch publizieren, aus dem Bereich der wissenschaftlichen Mitarbeiter und Mitarbeiterinnen das auch gewürdigt bekommen, indem sie eben einen Preis für ein besonders gutes Paper in englischer Sprache bekommen. Vielen Dank nochmal für die Initiative, die Frau Giertz eben entwickelt hat als Internationalisierungsbeauftragte hier in unserem Hause. Es sind insgesamt 9 Paper eingegangen und die wurden von einer Jury, die bestand aus Frau Klagge, Frau Dubowik, Herrn Schrott und aus meiner Wenigkeit, ich bin der Vorsitzende dieser ehrenvollen Jury, haben wir also 2 Papiere herausgenommen, die die Kriterien der Ausschreibung erfüllen. Es geht einmal um die Internationalität im Anspruch, es geht um die fachliche Relevanz, die fachliche Qualität, es geht um Fragen auch der Hierarchie quasi dieser Zeitschrift, und es geht um Fragen, inwieweit sich von dort aus Verlinkungen in die internationale Welt quasi herstellen lassen. Und unter diesem Aspekt haben wir eben 2 Paper jetzt herausgenommen. Eins ist von Herrn Blöthe verfasst und eins ist von Herrn Bachmann verfasst. Sie werden dann Ihre Papiere im Rahmen einer Veranstaltung am 18.11. dann vorstellen. Da bin ich dann unterwegs und deshalb haben wir jetzt diese Preisverleihung vorweggenommen, und Frau Giertz wird dann durch diese Veranstaltung moderierend führen, und dann wird die Gelegenheit sein, die Papiere inhaltlich entsprechend zu präsentieren. So, jetzt bin ich so weit bis in die Geschichte zurückgegangen, habe aber 2 wichtige aktuelle Akteurinnen vergessen, nämlich Frau Werner und Frau Evers, die auch in der Jury dabei gewesen sind.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Simone. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining my presentation on Rock-glacier dams in High Asia. Before diving into the topic, let me thank the jury for their work in the selection progress, but also for awarding our work with this award. A great pleasure to get this award for the first time. This is actually awarded. And a special thanks to Simone for actually initiating this award. Not just because I am receiving this award now, but also because I really think that awards like this can foster the academic careers of young scientists, and so this is quite important. And then on a personal note, many of you know that I have left the institute to now work at the University of Freiburg, and I had never the chance to give a proper goodbye due to the pandemic, and now it's not a proper goodbye, but it's at least nice that I get the opportunity to present what I have been working on in the past years, at least partly in a lecture like this on the GIUB International Paper Award. So now, without further ado, I'll start my lecture on rock-glacier dams in High Asia. Not surprisingly, you are looking at a rock-glacier dam here. So in the image, you see a form of a lot of debris with some trees on it, and it seems to be situated in the middle of the valley. This is a rock glacier, I can tell you. A rock glacier is a mixture of debris and ice, and is flowing under the force of gravity following the slope down valley. And this rock glacier, this particular one, was flowing so far down valley that it came from its tributary valley and entered the main valley, disrupting the river channel. And this is kind of the motivation for our study. But rock glaciers are the focus of a lot of studies, and why that might be, I'll quickly try to summarize. So rock glaciers are permafrost features. Yeah, they are containing ice, and they are permanently containing ice, so they belong to the features of permafrost. So if we map rock glaciers, we have an idea of where permafrost is located. So they are diagnostic landforms of permafrost, and we can, from mapping then, deduce the distribution of permafrost in a mountain range. Containing ice, they also potentially store a large amount of waters, and so they are important water reservoirs. And ongoing climate change, which I indicated by this warming stripes, the warming stripes of Kazakhstan in this case, ongoing climate warming threatens rock glaciers. Yeah, so not only glaciers are melting, but permafrost is also degrading in a warming climate. And so it is quite important nowadays to know how much ice is actually stored in rock glaciers. And for that, we for sure, first of all, need to know something on the distribution of rock glaciers. But this will not be the topic of my talk today. We were looking at a completely different aspect of rock glaciers, not the hydrological relevance of rock glaciers, but we were looking at the aspect of how rock glaciers are actually interacting or interfering with mountain rivers. Yeah, so rock glaciers, as I described earlier, sometimes enter river valleys, and kind of modulate the style the river has. This can be like in figure A that you see here, or F and G, which depict full blockages. So rock glaciers completely dammed the river valley, leading to the development of a lake. Or it can be like in picture or image B and D, that the river is only pushed to the side of the valley, is constricted, or at least river flow is kind of inhibited. And when we reviewed the literature, we saw that this topic of damming or interfering between rock glaciers and river channels has so far escaped the scientific inquiry. So we thought it might be a good idea to actually look at this topic. Why in High Asia? High Asia has a lot of arid mountain ranges, and so rock glaciers are very prominent in arid mountain ranges. So supposedly rock glaciers are very frequent in High Asia. And also the dwindling glaciers in High Asian mountain regions jeopardize water security of billions of people. So the relevance is clear. So our work on rock glacier dams was published in Earth Surface Processes and Landforms. And if I say our work, it is now time to acknowledge my co-authors, Svenja Rosenwinkel, Thorsten Höser. Some of you might know him. He was a bachelor and master student at Bonn, and Oliver Korup, who is mainly responsible for the statistical analysis that we did in this paper. He was also the supervisor of my PhD in Potsdam. So the aims of our study on rock glaciers were, first of all, to start a regional reconnaissance of rock glaciers in 3 High Asian mountain ranges, assess the possible impact on high mountain rivers of these rock glaciers. And then third, to use a Bayesian logistic regression approach to identify variables that actually control or explain whether or not rock glaciers are impacting mountain rivers. A quick recap on what rock glaciers actually are. Rock glaciers can be defined as the visible expression of cumulative deformation by long-term creep of ice debris mixtures under permafrost conditions. And in the image down here, you see a rock glacier in the Karakoram that is actually damming a lake. And you see this distinct surface texture, kind of ridge and furrow topography, this is referred to. It resembles very closely the appearance of lava flows. So a vicious flow that produces this. A side note on kitchen geomorphology, it also resembles pudding if you drop it on an inclined surface. So a lot of features are kind of resembling rock glaciers. I always don't like it if somebody tells me, oh yeah, this is moving, but I can't see that it's moving. So what I'm going to show you now is 2 images, high resolution satellite images collected by the Rapid Eye mission, one from 2010, one from 2018. And I'd like to draw your attention to the northern part of this image where you see some bedrock here. And if I start this animation now, you see the bedrock is not moving. There are some shadows that move, but all these features here, these large debris masses are moving. They are not moving very fast. Rock glaciers in the European Alps tend to attain speeds of decimeters per year, maximum meters per year. In this instance, it's a couple of meters per year, but way slower than ice glaciers are. Yeah? Okay, after this very quick recap on how rock glaciers look like, I'll come to the first part of my presentation, or the first results of my presentation. So what we did in order to deliver on this goal, regional reconnaissance of rock glaciers, we mapped a lot of them. Yeah, you can see in the right-hand side here some images how rock glaciers look like. They are not always looking the same. So it's a lot of work to sit down and map these features from satellite imagery. We mapped more than 2,000 of these with a minimum surface area of 25,000 square meters. And we did this in 3 regions, in the Karakoram, the Tian Shan, and the Altai. You see here the distribution of numbers. So these 2,000 rock glaciers are distributed as follows. In the Altai, we mapped more than 500, in the Tian Shan more than 600, and in the Karakoram more than 900 of these specimens. Some of them are impacting the river system. Some are even damming the river system, but you can directly see that the damming is not very frequent, but we argue it is still significant. We did mapping in 48 squares of 25 by 25 kilometers, which you see here, how we kind of mapped all these red, it is appearing like dots here, but these are polygons. And then we used these rectangles also to calculate some statistics. You can see that here, these are the same rectangles. And what you see here in these blue numbers, or these blue triangles with numbers, is the rock glacier density in the respective compartment, and in red, the glacier density. And the only point I want to make here is that rock glaciers in some parts are more frequent than glaciers are. So, for example, down here in the central part of the Altai, which we are looking at here, we have a distribution or a density of 1.8% rock glaciers, but only 0.4% covered by glaciers. So in favorable conditions, rock glaciers are very frequent in High Asia. This is the only point I want to make with this figure. If we look at the numbers, we see, or the size distributions of the rock glaciers that we mapped in these 3 regions, we see that they have very, very similar size distributions. Yeah, so rock glaciers in general are not very distinct among these 3 regions. They are kind of the same, at least judging from their appearance. They also have quite closely matching mean annual air temperatures, at least for the Karakoram and the Tian Shan, which you see in the 2 curves quite nicely matching here. And you can also from these distributions see that some of these are close to 0 degrees. And so in the light of global warming, these features that are sitting very close to 0 degrees temperature are very prone to permafrost degradation in the future. What is also striking is that the majority of all the rock glaciers that we were mapping, or the lowest parts, the rock glacier toes, lie within 250 vertical meters of the regional mean elevation. The regional mean elevation here on the right-hand side is the dashed line, and the distribution with the solid line is the distribution of elevations of rock glacier toes. And they are always quite close to each other. And we observed this not only here, but also in our data from Argentina, which is quite striking. Also, what we can see here, can take from this data, is that the clustering, the close clustering of rock glacier toes in a sharp elevation band tells us that there is a sharp boundary of alpine permafrost that we are looking at here. So how do these rock glaciers interfere with mountain rivers? I just brought you two of the images, actually showing 6 of the more than 2,000 rock glaciers that we were mapping, but you can easily see these two together are damming a lake. This one potentially formerly dammed a lake, but now just has some aggradation up here. This one enters a river valley. So we have a lot of examples on how rock glaciers interfere with the mountain rivers. As we did this exercise, or our work, with a lot of examples, we couldn't classify them all visually, so we classified them based on a automated analysis, and this was just by distance, a Euclidean distance between rock glacier and river of less than 90 meters. This was defined as impact. And if we look at the results, 21 of these rock glaciers impound lakes. This is visual interpretation, and these lakes disconnect sediment travel from upstream, so they inhibit the sediment transfer in the fluvial system. 5 to 14% of the mapped rock glaciers impact river channels, and these are actually in total, I'm sorry, no, this is the next point I'm making here. We estimate that 95 kilometers of river channels, so lengths of rivers, is actually buried beneath 189 rock glacier toes, or at least constricted by these toes entering the river channel, at least influencing sediment transport, not blocking it completely, but probably diminishing sediment transport. And this is what we are showing in this figure on the right-hand side. Again, we are looking at the Altai Mountains, and now in these rectangles that you already know, you see the area located upstream that is actually impacted by rock glacier dams, or by rock glaciers that interfere with the fluvial system, or that the area that is completely dammed by a rock glacier dam that has a lake, for example. And you see that in some parts, 12% of these 25 by 25 kilometers are actually influenced by rock glacier dams. Up here, 45% of the area are influenced at least by an impact, so a constriction of a valley. But what actually controls this, this impact of the river system? Can we identify regional controlling mechanisms that tell us which rock glaciers are more prone to actually interfering with the river system? And this is where the Bayesian logistic regression kicks in. And probably it's a good idea to quickly try to decompose what Bayesian robust logistic regression might be. Logistic regression is quite popular, and in its essence, logistic regression predicts a binary category variable, or a categorical variable, or just predicts binary data. The logit model that stands behind this logistic regression quantifies the probability of data belonging to a binary class using maximum likelihood function. So this is a nonlinear classification. In geomorphology, mainly used for predicting landslide susceptibility, but also for mapping permafrost distribution. Robust, in statistics, robust refers to models that are not overly influenced by outliers. So robust statistics are robust against outliers in our data distribution. And finally, the Bayesian, this might make a small detour necessary. Even though I am not the expert on Bayesian statistics, I hope I can quickly explain one essential difference between Bayesian and, let's say, classical statistics. So the essence of Bayesian statistics is named after Thomas Bayes, is that in Bayesian inference, we can reallocate credibility across possibilities. Credibility is the Bayesian term for probability. Yeah, and in a nice textbook on Bayesian statistics, the author argues that actually Sherlock Holmes, what he does is Bayesian inference. So when Holmes tells Watson, how often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, that this is actually Bayesian inference. And the idea behind Bayesian inference of this reallocation of credibility is that we have a number of possibilities. Yeah, this might be our model. We have 4 possibilities. And in the beginning, we say, oh, all these possibilities are equally likely. But then we find evidence that, that A is impossible. And then we distribute our probabilities or credibilities in a Bayesian term to the remaining 3. And this goes on. And so our probability is driven by data. Yeah, the more data that we gather, the more constricted is our model. And the fundamental difference between classical or frequentist statistics and Bayesian statistics is exactly this idea. So in a frequentist way, we look at our data and try to link it to a model that we have in our mind, or that we have constrained by parameters. And in the Bayesian idea, it is always the data that is fixed, and we just try to quantify how good our model fits the data. Yeah, so Bayesian inference is interested in the parameter space that likely produced data, and it explicitly tries to quantify uncertainties. Okay. If you want to know more about Bayesian statistics, I'd recommend reading an article by Oliver Korup, who was also co-author on this paper, on Bayesian geomorphology. But in the remaining, I'm nearly done with my talk. In the remaining minutes, I'll quickly run you through our results that we obtained. So the logistic regression we did with a couple of parameters that we thought are likely influencing rock glacier dams. And our model tells us credibly that we can discern rock glaciers that impact rivers from rock glaciers that do not impact rivers, only by a couple of parameters. So we tested 59 parameters, but in the end, it's only 7 parameters who really give us an idea of either damming or not damming. Yeah, so in order to break this down a bit, reducing parameter space and making make the graph more interpretable, we also try to model the effect or the likelihood of rock glaciers damming or not damming rivers with only 2 parameters. And we did this here with toe elevation and rock glacier area, for example, here in the upper plot. And then we create decision boundaries. Yeah, so likely boundaries that tell us if there's no impact or if there's an impact. And from these, we can actually start predicting data, or predicting the likelihood that a new rock glacier that we are seeing, that, for example, has a given size and a given toe elevation, has producing a dam, yeah, or interfering with high mountain rivers. So from our data, we can derive a predictive model that we can use for assessing future impact of rock glaciers on mountain rivers. Okay, this is basically all that that I wanted to tell you on our paper today. So quickly recapitulating the regional reconnaissance, we produced a large inventory of more than 2,000 rock glaciers that indicate a high spatial density in high Asian mountain belts, and these are important for future water resources. We see an effect on mountain rivers, 5% to 14% of rock glaciers buried, blocked, diverted, or constricted rivers. And we find some variables that seem to control the impact of rock glaciers on mountain rivers, and these are the elevation of rock glacier toes, potential incoming solar radiation, the size of rock glaciers, and the size of their basin. So these variables help us credibly distinguishing between damming rock glaciers and non-damming rock glaciers. And it seems that larger and lower lying rock glaciers are more likely to impact mountain rivers. We conclude that rock glaciers or rock glacier dams are conspicuous features, and we encourage for sure more research on their geomorphic impact. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions, and I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much.
Thanks to the jury for this award. I can only echo what Jan already said. This was really a very, very nice surprise, and I was very pleased to receive this award for the human geography side. So thanks again for putting this together in the first place, and then for this award. I'm very pleased with that. Well, you've already given the title of the paper, Trans-Regionalism and South-South Cooperation, Afrasia instead of Eurafrique, or Eurafrique to take on the old French term. And I'm very happy to discuss the problematics of these two pan-regional terminologies, and also of a paper appearing in a journal called Third World Quarterly. So I'm happy to discuss that later if you're interested in it. Before that, I would like to start with and I invite you to have a brief look at that and explain that this has already been, that I took this cartoon already out of a Kenyan daily newspaper called the Daily Nation almost 13 years ago, to say something about how long these processes have been going on. So what you see here is the West, itself a questionable category, evidently, portrayed as a, maybe to put it mildly, a well-nurtured Western gentleman with a cigar, who's leaving, who's parting from his beloved throne and leaves the throne to China, to a Chinese gentleman. And there are two aspects that I would like to emphasize as regards this cartoon. And the first one is, of course, that the throne is still carried by Africans. Yeah? That indicates the continued external exploitation of Africa by an external ruler. And then second, of course, the shift of this external ruler from the West to China. And it's those kind of geopolitical transformations, or rather, as a matter of fact, perceptions of geopolitical transformations that I discuss in this paper. And I approach these transformations through a political geographical lens that is interested in global spaces of interaction and hierarchies of power, and in particular, again, the transformation of those hierarchies of power. The empirical context that this paper emerged from, and you have already indicated that, Simone, has been the project Afrasia, which stands for Africa's Asian Options, and was a project that focused on African Asian, and then there comes the putting together of the words Afrasian spaces of interaction. However, it did so against the background of wider debates on the supposed shift of geopolitical organization away from global South-North to global South-South relations. Porrica Modi calls this the geopolitics of South-South relations. And in his study on the BRICS in Africa, he identifies a mega-regional imaginary, which he calls South Space. This is a region defined by history, material flows, and purportedly more equal, less exploitative social relations than those characteristic of North-South relations. And as regards this notion of a South Space, I essentially want to highlight three aspects in this talk today. They're elaborated a bit more theoretical in the paper, but for the sake of the talk, I want to give rather empirical examples of that. So the first one of these aspects refers to spatial constructions of regionalism, or as Kamodi wrote, a mega-regional imaginary. Yeah, this is a region he's talking about. The other two aspects articulate how those regional spatialities are constructed both materially and discursively. Yeah, the former refers to increased flows of aid, trade, investment, people, and the latter refers to a powerful counter-narrative to real or perceived forms of European or Western neo-imperialism. Essentially, the story goes as such. The Western model of liberal democracy, and in particular, the European model of regional integration, has failed. And this is illustrated by all the problems in the EU, the financial crisis, what we call the migration crisis, the disputes over Brexit, and so forth and so forth. At the same time, other development models, and in particular, I'm talking here about China's market authoritarianism, provide a much more interesting development model. And this becomes interesting because of impressive economic growth rates and a much more general perception of growing Chinese influence in the world. And this is a pervasive narrative that we find in many debates on what Kamodi calls South Space, or what others call South-South cooperation, SSC, South-South cooperation. So what those debates often share is a popularity of regional ideas, whereas these regional ideas, these notions of regionalism, can differ substantially. On the one hand, there are those that articulate one global southern region, the global south, and this would be Porrick Kamodi, Emma Maudsley, Chaturvedi, and so forth. On the other hand, you have those that suggest a subcontinental regional integration and cooperation, often as parts of debates on trans or interregionalism. And here I'm talking about people like Matthias Midel, Ulf Engel, Alia Gana, or Jan Richard in the French context. But either way, the idea of regionalism remains very prominent, as we can see by the abundance of RECs, regional economic communities, that you can see on the screen now, illustrated for Africa. Again, I can say a bit more about that later if you're interested. But for the moment, there are two aspects that I would like to emphasize. First, this popularity is to a very large extent rhetorical. We are talking here about debates on South-South cooperation. And second, this rhetorical popularity of regional integration is very often linked to the EU and based on decades of cooperation with the EU. For the EU, the cooperation with other regions around the world is absolutely essential. It has pushed regional integration in Africa for over half a century based on the belief, or wanting to make believe, that this is a good way to generate development, and of course also as a way to position itself as a model that can then be emulated somewhere else. So we see a persistence of regional ideas on a rhetorical level and as regards African-European interaction. And now the question comes, the big but, how does that play into the cooperation with southern partners, and in particular China? And to what extent China is a southern partner or not, of course, also is a question of debate. And on this, I want to show you some results of my fieldwork in East Africa. And the results distort a little bit this rhetorical popularity of regionalism and regional integration. Yeah, because what we can observe, if you look on the practical level of interaction, on the materialization of South-South cooperation, in particular with China, is that regional ideas virtually play no role. There is a very strong focus on bilateral intergovernmental interaction. And I want to illustrate that now, showing you a few quotes. The first quote I will show you was from an interview with advisor to the Kenyan government that was dealing the role of the EAC, the East African Community, and the function for the Kenyan government. So I asked rather bluntly, as a matter of fact, why then does the EAC even still exist? Well, his response was equally blunt and quite direct, very clear, because money comes through it, evidently. Huh? And of course, this refers to the cooperation with the EU or with other Western countries. As regards cooperation with China, and now I'm paraphrasing, no money comes through it anymore. As such, the EAC or other regional institutions lose their legitimacy, they lose their raison d'etre. And clearly this is a rather radical viewpoint, but it certainly was not an exclusive one that appeared in the interviews. Then, with respect to the how and what of South-South cooperation, another informant, this time a person, an official from the Kenyan Foreign Ministry, explained. China has done much work on infrastructure, roads, railways. China has made things easy for us. Europeans are very bureaucratic and have much conditions. Nothing is easy. Sometimes they say things are not feasible. With China, we see change in our lives. I chose this quote because it's quite strong, I think. It's exemplary for many aspects that popped up throughout the research, and it points to three key characteristics of South-South cooperation that are essential both for African and for Asian partners. And in particular, when we talk about state-to-state interaction. The first of these aspects is to focus on large-scale infrastructure projects as visible signs of progress and development. People can see change in their lives, as the person says here. This contributes to popular support for the government and for Chinese investment Chinese investment for delivering such development. Second aspect is the absence of conditionalities. Conditionalities mean conditions that are attached mostly to Western development cooperation. Guidelines, conditions is the best word, that are required to be fulfilled in order for Western development cooperation to occur. Good governance, human rights, an insistence on the rule of law, the freedom of press, freedom of speech, and so forth. Without those conditions, many Western partners will not conduct development cooperation. With China, there are no such conditionalities attached. China pursues largely a so-called hands-off policy. We are not interested in your internal affairs. And the third point refers to the speed of implementation and the lack of bureaucracy. This is about getting things done and getting things done fast. And if you talk about bureaucracy, I think all of us who have ever tried to put together a grant application to Horizon 2020 or another European program know very well what's meant here with European bureaucracy. Of course, all these factors that I mentioned now are factors that are highly favorable for the interaction between two governments. And indeed, the quotes I showed you are from interviews with Kenyan government officials or an advisor to the government. If we change now the viewpoint and have a look at non-governmental actors, we get a somewhat differentiated picture. And we can see how two of those four aspects appear in a rather different light. Clearly, non-governmental actors, civil society organizations, have a different take on intergovernmental bilateral interaction. This is quite evident given their exclusion from that. But they also have a different take as regards the lack of conditionalities. Another informant that I interviewed, this time the person was a director of the overarching association of civil society organizations in East Africa. So this person explained, for the government, the emergence of China and India and others was very good because they now have the option to just not accept conditionalities of Western countries and can choose other cooperation partners. They have alternatives. But now we as the civil society, we have to defend human rights against the government. So while the issues of infrastructure and speed of implementation also appear very important to the civil society, to non-governmental organizations, the insistence of external actors on certain conditions is generally seen as a welcome support to their own agenda, in particular as regards issues like human rights, like the rule of law, like good governance, and so forth. The same informant then continues. From the human rights perspective, it is difficult to deal with China. For us, the rule of law is very important. So it's often easier to deal with Europe. However, what I cite now from my interview is, of course, not, it's a bit too simplistic to draw a picture here that would portray a good governance coalition of European and civil society actors against a bad coalition of governmental and Chinese actors. It's clearly not as easy as that. The civil society organizations share the resistance against European paternalization. Their concern is very much with self-determination and societal participation in the development process. So civil society organizations tend to see development much more inclusively than governmental actors. As regards the difference of external partners, civil society organizations tended to have a much more nuanced and differentiated picture. China is very much appreciated for its development intervention, for its focus on infrastructure, and for the lack of bureaucratization. But it's also criticized for a lack of good governance aspects. The EU is resented for its continued paternalization, for continued neo-imperial practices, but it's very much appreciated as a partner on social dimensions of development. Again, I'm talking here about this inclusive development. The big difference between non-governmental and governmental actors, I would say, is that the non-governmental actors see good governance, human rights, the rule of law, very much as intrinsic values, not as a European imposition, but something that's as much Kenyan as it European. This is something intrinsic that's equally valid for everybody and not something that somebody from the outside is trying to impose on us here. So as a final and short point, given the time, I want to come back to the aspect I mentioned in the beginning, the aspect of materiality. And for so doing, I use some trade statistics of the International Monetary Fund. What you can see here is an illustration of the change of extra-African trade between 2006 and 2016. White are the imports and black are the exports. And the thicker the connection you see illustrated in this graph, the larger the increase. Well, the trends in this graph are quite clearly visible. You see a massive increase in trade with so-called emerging economies, in particular China, but also Turkey, India, Indonesia, and Russia. At the same time, you see relatively little increase as regards to imports from the EU or the United States, or even a reduction of exports. We can see the same thing, of course, in the table that lies around this graph, but I'm showing you this table because we can see something else here, and that is now highlighted in red, that the overall share of trade with the EU remains absolutely decisive. The EU is by a very large margin the biggest trading partners for African countries as regards both imports as well as exports. In both cases, trade with the EU adds up to roughly 1/4 of the total and is therefore about double the volume as the trade with China. So at least if we look at these very simplifying figures of trade, African-European relations remain immensely important. And with this observation, I come now to the conclusion, and such a clear shift are simply a bit premature. The situation is a bit more complicated than that. Instead of a clear shift from one to the other, we see a lot of complementarity. Yeah, in some contexts, European partners are preferred. In other contexts, China or other southern partners are preferred. But for both governmental and non-governmental agents, the partners are chosen very pragmatically, depending on how the partners actually best serve the particular interest. This goes hand in hand with a general absence of ideological notions of Southern solidarity. Clearly, European paternalization and neo-imperialism is rejected. The Chinese hands-off policy is appreciated by governmental actors, but there is no illusion that also these new partnerships are very fundamentally interest-led. The third point, the articulation of regionalism is also very pragmatic. For the EU, it is a reason in itself, but it appeared rather as a means for the pursuit of certain interests for the African partners I've communicated with. There is a strong political rhetoric towards it, in particular as it comes for the interaction of European actors. But this is pretty much absent in the interaction with Southern actors, and therefore I would that this regional and trans-regional rhetoric that's often employed in South-South cooperation is to some extent misplaced. So to now finally sum up, as I've mentioned before, I think it's too easy to postulate such a general shift, and the things are much more complex. What we can observe, however, is that these geopolitics of South-South relations, as Porrick Kamodi puts it, are offering an alternative for African countries and society, and thus carry very much an emancipatory moment. And that in itself, I think, is of considerable value for enhancing the negotiation position of African actors vis-à-vis any external partner, be they Asian or be they European. And with this, I close and bedanke mich für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Vielen Dank.